Chapter 3, Names and Shadows. The dawn was a bleak shade of gray, just like every other day in the wastes. As I strapped my satchel to the back of my battered old motorbike, I couldn't shake the feeling that today was different. Marcus stood nearby, his own bike, ready and waiting. The machine was a patchwork of old world and new, much like its rider, efficient, functional, and a little bit dangerous. "Before we go," Marcus said, breaking the silence, "I think it's important you know who you're traveling with." He extended his hand. Marcus Wainwright, tracker, navigator, and sometimes a bit of a troublemaker. I eyed his hand warily before shaking it. His grip was firm, steady. Trevor Callahan, scavenger, survivor. He smiled, a brief flash of teeth. "Not much for sharing, are you?" "Just here for the job," I replied curtly, fastening the last strap on my bike. "I need to survive." Marcus nodded as if he'd expected no less. "Fair enough, but out there, we'll need to trust each other. The wastes have a way of testing alliances." I mounted my bike and looked over at Nimbus, who was perched on the seat behind me, ready for the ride. "Trust is earned," I said. "Let's get moving." We kicked our bikes into life, the engines roaring with a sound that echoed through the ruins. Fuel was scarce, but it could still be found if you knew where to look. Motor parts, though, were a different story. Those were worth more than gold. As we rode out of the settlement, the wind whipped at our faces, and the familiar sense of unease settled into my bones. The journey had begun. The landscape blurred past us, a desolate expanse of twisted metal and shattered concrete. We rode in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we hit a stretch of open road that Marcus spoke again. "You ever wonder about the world before?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "Not really," I lied. In truth, I often found myself imagining what life had been like before the war, before the world had turned to ash. But those thoughts were dangerous. They made you soft. Marcus seemed to sense my reluctance and changed the subject. "You know, I wasn't always a tracker, used to be a mechanic. Worked on bikes like these, kept them running." I glanced over at him. "That explains your ride." "Looks like it runs better than mine," he chuckled. "Yeah, well, you pick up a few tricks when your life depends on it. But being a mechanic wasn't enough. The wastes taught me that. So I learned to track, to navigate, figured out how to survive out here." "Why'd you leave?" I asked, genuinely curious now. "Mechanic seems like a safer job." "Safer," he agreed, "but not enough. My sister, she didn't make it. Got sick, and there wasn't anything I could do. I realized then that just surviving wasn't enough. I needed to do more, to be more." I nodded, understanding the unspoken pain in his words. Loss was a constant companion in this world. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "It's the past," Marcus replied, his voice hardening. "But it's also why I'm here. Madeline, our mayor, she's trying to build something better, a future, and I believe in that." I didn't respond, lost in my own thoughts. The idea of a future was almost laughable to me, but Marcus seemed sincere. Maybe there was something to it, or maybe it was just another dream destined to crumble. As the hours passed, we settled into a rhythm, the landscape changing subtly as we moved further from the settlement. The ruins gave way to more open spaces, fields of twisted metal and abandoned vehicles. We kept a watchful eye on the horizon, ever vigilant for threats. "You never said," Marcus began again, breaking the silence, "why you agreed to come. What's your story, Trevor?" I tightened my grip on the handlebars, feeling the familiar tension rise. "Nothing special, just trying to survive, like everyone else." "Fair enough," he said, though I could tell he wasn't satisfied. "But you're good at what you do. That counts for something." I shrugged, not really in the mood to delve into my past. "Let's just focus on getting to Raven's Hollow," he nodded, respecting my boundaries. "All right, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here." The rest of the day passed in a blur of gray and brown, the landscape monotonous and unforgiving. We stopped occasionally to check our bearings, consult the maps, and refuel. Conversation was sparse, but there was a growing sense of camaraderie between us, a silent understanding that we were in this together. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the ruins, we heard it, a distant, desperate scream. We both stopped, engines idling, and listened. It came again, closer this time, a high-pitched cry for help, filled with terror. We exchanged a glance, and without a word, we sped towards the sound. The scream led us to a narrow alleyway where a teenage girl was running for her life. a pack of hound dogs hot on her heels. The dogs were feral, their eyes wild and hungry, their bodies gaunt and skeletal. "Help!" the girl screamed, stumbling as she ran. "Please!" Marcus was off his bike in an instant, his crossbow in hand. I followed, drawing my knife. Nimbus hissed, her fur bristling as she leapt from the bike to join the fray. The first bolt flew true, taking down one of the hounds mid-leap. I moved to intercept another, my knife flashing in the dim light. The hound snarled and lunged, but I sidestepped, driving the blade into its side. It yelped and fell, blood pooling on the cracked pavement. Marcus reloaded with practiced ease, another bolt ready. The remaining hounds hesitated, that sensing the shift in odds. With a growl, they turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows. The girl collapsed to the ground, panting and trembling. Marcus knelt beside her, checking for injuries. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I think so. Thank you. They came out of nowhere." "You're safe now," I said, sheathing my knife. "What's your name?" "Ivy," she replied, wiping her eyes. "Ivy Thorne." "What are you doing out here, Ivy?" Marcus asked, his tone concerned. "This is no place for a kid." She looked away, shame and fear mingling in her expression. "I ran away, from a settlement. I couldn't stay there anymore." "Which settlement?" I asked, curious. "Havenbrook," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Havenbrook was known to be a tough place, but it was still better than the wilds. I couldn't imagine what would drive a girl her age to leave. "We need to get moving," Marcus said, glancing at the darkening sky. "It's not safe here. Ivy, can you ride with me? We'll get you somewhere safe." She nodded, still trembling, and climbed onto Marcus's bike. Nimbus leapt back onto mine, her eyes never leaving Ivy. As we rode away, the girl's story weighed heavily on my mind. What could have happened at Havenbrook to make her risk everything out here? And what dangers awaited us on the road to Raven's Hollow? The journey was far from over, and I had a feeling the answers we sought were just the beginning of a much larger story. To be continued.